Some of Donald Trump's staff picks don't appear to exactly match with his campaign promises and rhetoric, especially where it concerns Wall Street. Steve Mnuchin and Steve Bannon both formerly worked at Goldman Sachs, and the firm's current chief operating officer, Gary Cohn, is now being considered to lead the Office of Management and Budget. To discuss it all, we now want to turn to Vanity Fair contributing editor Bethany McLean, who also previously worked herself for Goldman Sachs. And Bethany, there's a long history, really, in Washington of Goldman Sachs employees and the payroll coming to work in the government. A few examples include former Treasury Secretaries Hank Paulson, Robert Rubin, President Obama's former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, also on the payroll. What to make, then, of this kind of influence over multiple administrations?
Absolutely right. There's been an enormous amount of Goldman Sachs influence in Washington over the years. There was a hue and cry about that in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, that this is something we have to change. On the campaign trail, President-elect Trump promised to change this and even ran explicit ads featuring Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein, saying, basically, this is what we need to change. And here we are with an incoming administration that looks to be very heavily stocked with Goldman people. So it's quite ironic.
I spoke earlier today with Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, who's a part of the transition team. And when I asked her this very question, she said, well, what you're really seeing, especially as it regards Wilbur Ross and Steve Mnuchin, is the outsiders who've been insiders. What do you make of that characterization?
That might be the way it is. One of the things, we in the media, pundits have been wrong about President-elect Trump all along. And I feel like it's definitely a case of watch what I do rather than what I say. And I feel like that's probably going to be true of the people he puts in these slots as well. Steve Mnuchin, for instance, was at Goldman, but he is no longer there. He's not a guy he's not one of the economist insider types who you might have thought would have been appointed to run Treasury, like Tim Geithner, like Jack Lew, who are very much those insider types. And we'll have to see what he does. Thus far, his comments on policy have been either opposed to what Trump has said, for instance, on tax policy, or they've been vague enough, for instance, about the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill and what his plans are there, that it's really hard to know what he's going to do. So my view is, rather than getting worked up about who these people are, let's see what they do.
What do you see happening to things like Dodd-Frank and other regulations put in place post-financial crisis?
Well, I'm a little bit middle of the road about this. You could have this reaction to the idea that Dodd-Frank needs to be reformed, changed, and say, oh, how horrible, they're seeking to give power back to the big banks. Or you can say any legislation is a work in progress. And there are certainly parts of the 2300 Dodd-Frank rule, which doesn't even include all the way the rules were written, that are really complex. And complexity actually isn't a good thing for anybody. I think if it's completely gutted, that's not a good thing, but I think it will be very hard to completely gut it, given the amount of money that banks have put into building their efforts to comply with Dodd-Frank. I think some changes, particularly ones that lighten the regulatory load on community banks, are really important.
And as it concerns Treasury specifically, while much has been made of this apparent shift in Donald Trump's campaign rhetoric as to now who we see stocking his cabinet, and with the selection of Steve Mnuchin, others have really said, frankly, there are few people who can really be Treasury Secretary who have not had experience on Wall Street. Right. What do you say?
I agree with that. You can view this, and a lot of people do, as the fox guarding the hen house. But if the fox actually is going to guard the hen house, you want the fox there. So one of the criticisms of Mnuchin, for instance, has been, well, he has no policy experience, and he's never run a department like this, and he doesn't know international tax law. Well, there are plenty of people at Treasury who know that stuff really well. The thing that you can't teach someone who doesn't know it is just the cynicism and the knowledge and the deep understanding of how the financial markets work that a guy like Mnuchin has. And if he uses that to good ends, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a negative. I think it's a positive.
Bethany, I also want to ask about the stock market. We saw futures, of course, election night plunge. But then the market itself, the Dow has risen to record levels since the election. What do you make of Wall Street's response thus far here?
Schizophrenic. I think it's. I think it's premature because, again, I think with this president-elect in particular, it's going to be watch what he does rather than what he says, especially when what he has said so far is so contradictory. So I think stock market celebration is premature. Certainly, the major promise to me that the incoming Trump administration is making is this idea that they can get the American economy to grow again by 3 or 4%, and that it's just a matter of convincing companies to keep jobs here and lightening regulations and getting banks to lend. We all know it's way, way, way more complicated than that. But if they can accomplish half of what they're talking about, there is a big reason for optimism. But that it's not going to be easy.
Donald Trump will be visiting the Carrier plant today in Indianapolis alongside his VP-elect, Indiana Governor Mike Pence today. Is that a win for Donald Trump?
I mean, it's definitely a publicity win, and it's a very small win, but it's a drop in the bucket, especially in the face of these two immense changes that have been affecting our economy, one being globalization and the other being technology. And that is going to continue to result in real pressure on jobs for the working class. And I'm not sure that 1,000 jobs saved at a Carrier plant is as gigantic a swing as people are making it out to be in the face of that enormously complicated larger picture.
Is it also worth the precedent that appears to have been set here that essentially CEOs can now threaten, it would appear, to move jobs beyond U.S. borders unless they got similar deals?
Well, that's not a new precedent, right? CEOs have been threatening to do that for a long time, and cities have been extending tax breaks and all sorts of other accommodations to them. To go back to Goldman Sachs, right? They kept their offices in Manhattan in part because of large inducements extended by the city to stay there. So this is nothing new. It's perhaps a variation on that theme, but it's nothing new.
Bethany McLean, we very much appreciate the time and insight today.
Thank you so much.